Okay, hi. This is my presentation on early intervention and atypical ASL. Early intervention is exactly what it sounds like. It's just intervention early in a child's life, early in the stages of their life. For children and deaf children especially, it's very crucial for early intervention to be taking place because it helps with their brain and language development as well as their learning. Early intervention of ASL, deaf children, children who are hard of hearing, and children who are at risk of losing their hearing can receive the proper and necessary tools they need, whether it be at school for as an interpreter or in the house. Um, Early intervention also gives the families the support they need as well because going from maybe having hearing kids and then a deaf child is a big transition because now you don't know whether how to go about it. Sometimes people just want to put them in the oral setting, or sometimes families will pick up ASL for the child so they can receive proper support in that case too. Um, Early intervention also gives the families the option to choose the cochlear implant or ASL. Um, those families who usually choose the cochlear implant is because they don't want their child to be viewed as disabled, and also possibly because they don't want to pick up another language because that just changes their life as well. And if they can make their child hear and go to school and live a life that they consider as normal, they'll do that. And because of that, people don't choose ASL because they feel like that hinders the language development, being like hearing and using ASL. With that comes the infant hearing program. This is the process where parents and families can know the auditory status of their child before they turn one. And this is a great breakthrough because sometimes there were parents who had a child who was deaf and for a whole year was unaware. Maybe they just thought their language is delayed. But with the IHP, that helped to mitigate language development, especially in deaf and hard of hearing children. The IHP also allows parents to make a decision as to whether they want to choose the cochlear implant, ASL, or both. With the IHP and studies in Canada, Canada didn't properly give the adequate options to those parents who decided to use the cochlear implant. With the IHP, your parents are allowed to be given the option to give the deaf child a cochlear implant and still allow the child to learn ASL. In Canada, they did not allow that. That's because they thought that if the child had a cochlear implant, learning ASL would hinder them, so they did not give parents that option. And so deaf children in Canada who were given the cochlear implant just went to an all-hearing school and led this oral and hearing lifestyle. But when they were exposed to ASL later in their life, they did struggle. So studies show that kids who do get the cochlear implant should still be exposed to ASL because even if they do choose to remain with the cochlear implant, they can still show great performance as if they were deaf of deaf. And those who decide to use the cochlear implant but maybe later on forget about it and use ASL can also show great performance linguistically. Those who are deaf of deaf and choose to use ASL can also experience something called atypical ASL, which is when children who are deaf struggle with visual spatial aspects of ASL. Difficulty with visual spatial aspects can have a very severe toll on the child's comprehension of the language, not just in order to comprehend it, but to carry it out themselves as well. And there's a case study of a young girl, 15 years old, named Alice. She was a native signing deaf girl who was born in a deaf family, but in school and at home, her parents and her teachers and her family realized that she was having trouble developing her ASL skills. So in order to pinpoint where she was having complete trouble with, there was tests conducted to find out what was it that she wasn't fully comprehending and why she couldn't fully carry out a conversation in ASL. So the tests that were conducted were general background information asking about her life at birth and growing up until her age of 15. General language assessment was her general fluency in ASL. Neuropsychological assessment was to test her cognitive, executive memory, motor skills, behavior and emotional functioning, and visual processing. This was only a test that was standard for adolescents, like her age group, not for adolescents, adults, and kids. It was just adolescents. The tests continued were non-standardized visual spatial tests that just tested her perspective ability, whether she can how she could perceive signs when they're directly in front of her, or say she was sitting in a classroom and at an angle. The next one is shortened to PTSO. This is her perspective taking skills in comparison to classifiers and how to properly use them. And lastly, her results were just compared to other native signers around her age to see how she scored in comparison to them. So with her background information, she was born full term but was placed in intensive care for hypoxia and later had an infection at 1 year old, a scalp infection. She had a concussion at 7, but she didn't go unconscious from the concussion. She had vision issues at 8 but never failed an eye exam. And while she was in school, she would have trouble sequencing events, and she had a different timing in ASL, which is what her teachers reported. Her ASL proficiency, she passed successfully but didn't use facial expressions. For neuropsychological assessment, she had average intelligence, but her processing and motor skills were below average. Her PTSO was very low compared to her peers. And so to pinpoint that, they realized that her main struggles were perspective taking, where she confused her lefts and rights. She was having trouble with signer's perspective, and because of that, she couldn't fully carry out a conversation in ASL correctly in a linguistic manner, even though she was of even though she was of average intelligence. And to help that, as she got older, they didn't leave her out to dry. They still continued to sign to her directly, and they also kept testing her perspective taking skills. So whether she could see a sign, like signs at an angle or maybe at the side of somebody. So that's how they carried on with that. And in the conclusion, deaf children who are given the cochlear implant should still be exposed to ASL, because later in their life they could be exposed to ASL and they could struggle severely. Those children who are deaf of deaf and decide to use ASL can still experience a language barrier, even though they've been exposed to the language their whole life. And early intervention is very important because it helps to catch the language barriers, and with that, if it's caught early enough, children who develop these language barriers can still be linguistically strong and use their language, ASL, correctly, as if they never had barriers to begin with. And, yep, that's the end of my PowerPoint.